The English intended to take Paris. Edward certainly reached the walls. Philip of France, perhaps thinking that Edward intended to bypass Paris and head on to Gascony, had an uncertain start, but he had superior forces, and the English withdrew. The war then continued in country which became grimly familiar in the early days of the 20th century: Amiens, the Somme, Picardy, Abbeville, until the two armies fought themselves to a standstill, the English lucky to escape defeat. But they still could not get back to the Channel coast without another fight. Crecy.
The king gathered his chiefs to supper, and afterwards to prayer. No other resolve was open than to fight at enormous odds. The king and the Prince of Wales, afterwards famous as the Black Prince, received all the offices of religion, and Edward prayed that the impending battle should at least leave him unstripped of honour. With the daylight, he marshalled about 11,000 men in 3 divisions. Mounted upon a small palfrey, with a white wand in his hand, with his splendid surcoat of crimson and gold above his armour, he rode along the ranks, encouraging and entreating the army that they would guard his honour and defend his right. Their position on the open rolling downs enjoyed few advantages, but the forest of Crecy on their flanks afforded protection and the means of a final stand.
Before it opened, both sides went through the parade of rituals and scorn that was all part of the bloody theatre of war. The French, with their vastly superior numbers, dashed about in front of their own and the English soldiers, acting out a battle charade of things to come. The chronicler, Geoffrey Le Baker, has left us an account of the battle.
The host stood in the field from daybreak until vespers, the impressive multitude of the French being continually increased by fresh arrivals. About sundown, after skirmishes of the redoubtable armies, the first charge was made by the French, with resounding trumpets, drums and kettledrums with strident clarions. And with shouting almost like thunder, the crossbowmen of the French advanced. But none of their quarrels reached the English. At the tremendous clamour of the crossbowmen, the English archers were called forth and riddled their adversaries with arrows. When they saw that their crossbowmen were not harming the English, the French men-at-arms, mounted on war horses, rode down the crossbowmen, standing to the number of 7,000 between them and the English, crushing them under the feet of their horses, rushing forward to show the English how brave they were. So anguished were the cries of pain from the trampled that those in the rear of the French thought it was the English who were being slain. Upon hearing all this, the French pressed forward on the heels of those in front. In this ill-considered ardour, the most conspicuous were raw young knights, in whom the army abounded, all panting for the great honour of capturing the King of England.
Edward was not going to make the same mistake as the French. His archers, superior to the French crossbowmen, were not going to be stood in the front ranks. Instead, he set them along the flanks so that they shot across from the sides of his army. And perhaps remembering the experience of the Scottish campaigns, when English knights tumbled and were slain in pits, the English now quickly dug holes in front of their positions. By now, it was dark.
A great outcry rose to the stars from the miserable and trampled crossbowmen and from the horses pierced by the arrows. The French became confused. Fighting with the English men-at-arms, they were beaten down with battle-axes, lances and swords, and in the middle many Frenchmen were crushed to death without any wound, but by the weight of numbers. In such a woeful encounter, Edward of Woodstock, the king's eldest son, being then 16 years old, showed his valour to the French, piercing horses, laying low the riders, shattering helmets and breaking spears, helping his men and showing an example to all. The French repeatedly changed their front line, bringing up fresh hordes. These continual accessions of strength kept the prince and his companions so closely engaged that the great mass of the enemy compelled him to fight on his knees. Then someone wrote to the king, his father, imploring help. He was sent with 20 knights to help the prince, and found him and his men leaning on spears and swords and taking breath and resting quietly on long mounds of corpses. So, from sunset to the third quarter of the night, the French thrice raised hostile shouts against our men and attacked them 15 times. On the morrow, 4 fresh divisions of Frenchmen arrived, and as if no harm had befallen their side, they shouted at the English ostentatiously and began the 16th wave of attack. The English, although tired from yesterday's labours, after a great struggle, forced them to take flight. The total number of knights and men of superior dignity killed in this battle exceeded 4,000. No one troubled to count the others who were slain.
August the 25th was evidently spent by Edward in reconnaissance, while his army remained hidden in the forest of Crecy, enjoying a well-earned rest, for they had covered 335 miles in 32 marching days. That is, just over 10 miles per day. A nice position was found on the ridge immediately to the northeast of Crecy. This ridge is formed by a little valley, known as La Vallée au Clerc, which is scooped out of the prevailing high ground on the east side of the valley of the little river Maye. This river runs through the lower end of Crecy from the southeast, and the Vallée au Clerc joins it 1 mile from the centre of that village. The Vallée au Clerc is only 2,000 yards long, its left or upper end merging into the plateau just in front of the village of Wadicourt. The ridge thus formed between Crecy and Wadicourt was about 2,000 yards long, exclusive of both villages. The depth of the valley ranges from nothing on the left to nearly 100 feet on the right. Edward decided to make this ridge his position. On the highest point of the ridge, only 700 yards from the center of Crecy, stood a windmill. A few hundred yards behind the center of the ridge was a small wood, the Bois de Crecy Grange. The slope in front of the right flank of the position was about 1 in 12, and on the left of the position it was almost imperceptible. The right flank was protected against cavalry attack by the village and river, which was wider than it is now, whereas the left had merely the small village of Wadicourt as protection, with open country beyond. It was thus much the weaker flank of the two.
On Friday the 25th of August, Edward sent scouts towards Abbeville to find out whether Philip was going to attack that day. They returned to say they could see little sign of action. Sir Hugh de Spencer had meanwhile attacked Le Crotoy and returned with plenty of victuals. Edward remained uneasy, concerned that Philip would attack that following night. He gave orders for the army to camp in the open and to prepare a defensive formation. With still no sign of the French advance, he held a dinner for his nobles and captains. The men remained in their armour. Froissart states that when the lords had retired from the king's pavilion, the king spent several hours in a makeshift oratory, praying for victory, or at least honour. Without honour, he would be nothing, not even self-respecting. At around midnight, he went to bed. Next morning, Saturday the 26th of August, he was up before dawn. He summoned the prince to him, and together father and son heard Mass and received Holy Communion. Then, as the rest of the camp was stirring, they rode out to survey the surrounding area with Edward's principal commanders, including Northampton, Warwick, Cobham and de Harcourt. One can imagine Edward looking over the ground with care, lines from Vegetius echoing in his head. Perhaps he repeated some of them for the benefit of his son, or tested the prince on what he could remember. The nature of the ground is often of more consequence than courage. Or, if your forces are few in comparison to the enemy, you must cover one of your flanks either with an eminence, a city, the sea, a river, or some similar protection. Edward did not have the sea, and he did not want a river, far less a city. But there was the forest of Crecy. With that to cover one flank, he chose to place his standard at the top of a hill. He positioned his men in 3 battalions in front of it, across the hill. The first would be under the command of the Prince of Wales, and would include Warwick, de Harcourt, Cobham, Sir Thomas Holland, Sir Bartholomew Burghersh, Sir Thomas Clifford, Sir John Chandos, and many other outstanding knights, with 800 men-at-arms and the surviving 1,000 Welshmen. The second would be under Northampton, with the Earl of Arundel in support and a further 800 men-at-arms. To himself, he reserved the remaining 700 men-at-arms who would hold the rear, and about 2,000 archers. It went without saying that the other 4,000 or so archers would be on the flanks. Trapping the enemy was the essence of their power. The baggage wagons were carefully positioned. Some were used to make a corral around the horses, who were placed at the rear of the army near a windmill at the top of the hill. But some of those carts, which had rumbled over the rough roads of France all the way from Saint-Val-à-Auge, were placed with the archers. King Philip was about to discover why his army had been able to cover 30 miles in a day and the English could only manage half that. They had been protecting these carts. Strapped beneath them were about 100 small cannon. Now we can see how meticulous Edward's planning and preparation had been. The powder for these artillery pieces had been made at the Tower of London in March, long before landing in France. It had been hauled across the ford at Blanchetaque still dry. Until now, gunpowder had only been used in sieges, with the sole exception of Mortimer's use of crackis of war on the Stanhope campaign. Those had been dangerous exploding buckets by comparison with Edward's refined guns. As well as small cannon with calibers of roughly 4 inches, the shot was still stone. He brought his newly developed ribbalds, series of bound gun barrels designed to shoot metal bolts like crossbow bolts. And Edward not only had developed them, he had thought of how to use them too. That was why they were there with the archers, to catch the advancing French in the deadly crossfire. Edward had another surprise, also long in preparation. Beside his usual royal arms, he unfurled another banner, a painted dragon clothed in his own arms. It was his answer to the oriflamme. As the troops marched to their positions, they all saw this new symbol of English power and confidence. Drago, they called it, recalling the prophetic symbol of his grandfather, Edward I.
The French army that fought at Crecy was composed of 3 broad groups or categories of troops. First, there come what may be called the regular contingents, consisting in the main of the king's personal retinue of household troops and the Genoese mercenaries, a composite well-trained body under their own commander, Ottone Doria. They are usually assessed at 6,000 in number. They had played a prominent part in what fighting there had been during the previous 10 days, and had suffered heavily at the hands of the English archers. Next come the foreign notabilities, each with his own contingent. The principal of these were the grand old blind King of Bohemia, who had lived for years at the French court, with his son Charles, King of the Romans, and with his contingent of Luxembourgers. John, Count of Hainaut, the turncoat brother-in-law of the English king. James I, King of Majorca, the Duke of Savoy, and various German mercenaries. Their total contribution must have gone into the thousands. Lastly come the provincial levies, who answered the call of what amounted to a levée en masse. Even if we knew their total number, we should still not know what proportion of them had actually joined the army in time for the battle. Stragglers and distant contingents from the south were continually swelling the ranks, and the number present at any given time would be as difficult to assess as the numbers of Harold's shire levies that straggled onto the field of Hastings. The English chroniclers give figures, the favourite being the suspiciously round number of 100,000, but they are no real guide. The only point on which there can be hardly a doubt is that the French vastly outnumbered the English. Giving what amounts to no more than a guess, I would suggest that the French army approached 40,000 in number, and was about thrice as numerous as the English army. The strength of the English army, allowing 10% for wastage since the landing, was between 12,000 and 13,000. A front of 2,000 yards was distinctly extensive for an army of such a size, but it is probable that there were slight gaps between the 2 flanks and the 2 villages, thus reducing the frontage to about 1,700 yards. Even this may appear rather wide for a medieval army, but there is a feature of the terrain that tends to remove this objection. There are, on the forward slope, 3 terraces, or radions, as the inhabitants called them, 350 yards in length, and forming in all probability ancient cultivation strips. No reference is made to these terraces in the chronicles, which may seem surprising, because they must have been in existence at the time of the battle. But it must be remembered that we have no eyewitness account of the actual fighting. These terraces would prove an effective obstacle to the French horsemen, and thus could be very weakly held. By this means, a longer frontage could be held than would otherwise be the case. The terraces no doubt formed a convenient boundary between the two divisions that held the front line. The division on the right was, in accordance with normal custom, the vanguard of the army, the division of the Black Prince. It is convenient to use this title, although its first appearance in writing did not take place until 1569. His chief executive officers were the Earls of Warwick and Oxford, and the king put his trusted Godfrey Harcourt to act as his escort and tutor, as we might say, his chief duty being to see that the boy came to no harm. He placed his troops well down the slope, almost, if not quite, within 300 yards of the valley bottom, the right half standing on a smaller terrace than that mentioned above. The rear guard held the left of the position under the experienced leadership of the Earl of Northampton, who selected a line slightly higher up the slope than the 1st Division. The 3rd Division, that of the king, was kept in reserve a short way behind the centre of the line. The baggage was parked in a liga abutting on the Bois de Crecy Grange. The sides were made of the wagons and carts, one entrance only being made for greater security. The interior was occupied by the horses, for the king intended to fight the battle dismounted, no doubt advised thereto by Northampton, who had so successfully adopted that course at Morlaix a few years before. It had also been adopted at Falkirk, Halidon Hill, and Duplin Moor. The king selected as his post of command the windmill, which, though not centrally situated, allowed an uninterrupted view of the whole position and of the French advance. The reconnaissance being completed, the divisions took up their appointed positions, carefully and methodically. Some Welsh spearmen may have lined the terraces. Each man in the army was allotted his exact position, and he took it up as for a review. The archers dug small holes in front of themselves and planted a plentiful supply of arrows in the ground, recourse being had to the ammunition wagons for this purpose. For a longbowman could shoot off his supply of 24 or 48 arrows in a very few minutes. When all was in order, the review took place. It was one of the most momentous inspections in our history, for on it might depend whether the reviewing officer would continue to wear a crown on his head next day. The king rode on a white palfrey slowly along the line, unarmed but carrying a short white staff in his hand. With his experienced eye he peered intently at every man, occasionally halting to utter a few words of encouragement and good cheer to each unit in turn. Battle orders would have been issued previously by the marshals. It was perhaps midday before the review was over, and still there was no sign of the enemy. Meanwhile, the cooks had been busy in the wagon liga. A meal was prepared, and the king now gave orders that each man should fall out, relax, and feed. At the sound of the trumpet, everyone was instantly to resume his place. Each archer laid his bow alongside his arrows to mark his position, while each man-at-arms removed his helm. The meal was served, nature satisfied, and the men stood about in little groups discussing whether that Philip would dare show his face, and many a bet was made. Still the hours passed. Vespers, 4 p.m., approached, but no French army. The heavens became black with clouds, and at the threat of rain there was a sudden rush by the archers to protect their precious bowstrings. Each man unstrung his bow, coiled up the bowstring, and placed it inside his cap. The storm, when it came, was of short duration, and it passed off before any appearance of the French. At about 4 p.m. the French army started to descend the slope from Marcheville into the valley of the Maye. Its leading elements were spotted by the lookout, posted no doubt in the top story of the windmill. From there the news could be signalled directly to the king's tent, which would be between the ridge and the Crecy wood. Edward, having rushed forward to verify that his enemy was indeed approaching, gave the signal. The trumpets sounded, the groups broke up, the knights donned such armor as they had temporarily cast off, and all returned to their allotted posts. The French army was coming at last.
The English captains passed on the orders for pits 1 foot deep to be dug in front of their lines to break the charge of the French men-at-arms. As they worked, 4 French knights appeared in the distance, surveying the English array. Edward gave orders that they were not to be bothered or interrupted. Let them report to Philip how few they were in number. Let them see Drago. Let them tell the French army to come to them. For Edward was still dependent on being attacked. If his troops were drawn out and down to fight Philip and the French lords on their terms, the battle would be lost. Discipline was everything. He jumped onto a small palfrey and went among the ranks of men, carrying a white wand with which he made his gestures and directives clear to all those who could see him. And they listened. His words were words of honor. He spoke of the glory which they would win and of the rights they would uphold. Never again would the French king be able to hold the English people in contempt, no, nor the Pope. Froissart states that all who heard him, even those who were feeling afraid, were cheered by his presence, so positive and optimistic he seemed. He filled them with self-belief. And he did this as he rode at walking pace through all the ranks. Until 10 o'clock he rode among them, exhorting them to do their utmost. He commended them to the protection of God and the Virgin Mary. Then he gave orders for the army to sit down and rest some more and have food distributed so that they might be strong when the French came on the scene. Edward and his leaders met together for one last time in his pavilion. Those who were hungry ate, and they all drank a little. Then the pots and pans were packed up and sent away to the carts at the rear, and each lord resumed his place with his men, said his prayers, and waited. Edward might have been unfortunate with the weather at sea, but he surely would have gladly weathered all those storms again for the luck that came upon him now. It began to rain. The English sat or stood and waited in their positions as the summer grass beneath their feet was soaked, and as the grass grew damp, so did the crossbow strings of the Genoese, who were being force-marched to the front of the French army somewhere beyond their sight. Exhausted and insulted by their French employers, these Genoese had been chosen to lead the assault on the English, using archers against archers. But these crossbowmen needed time to shoot and reload, and they usually fired from behind their great shields. These shields were still in the wagon trains, somewhere behind them. No time for those, they were told. They would have to fight without them.
Orders were therefore dispatched along the line for all units to halt. But the order was only in part obeyed. Impulsive French knights, knowing the vast size of the French army, and supremely confident in their ability to win a great victory, ignored the order and pushed forward on top of those in front. Thus the Genoese who led were propelled forward whether they liked it or not, and, if only in self-defense, attempted to deploy and march against that portion of the English position that appeared opposite them. A glance at a map will show that the line of approach of the French army was oblique to the line of the English position. In order to form front to the position and march straight on the windmill which towered above it, they had to turn through some 40 degrees. For a large body, nearly 6,000 strong, to change direction to this extent and simultaneously deploy while being hustled by rude French knights in their rear required a higher tactics dexterity than even the experienced Genoese were capable of. In spite of their efforts, the line became hopelessly ragged and out of dressing, and in the course of the mile or so to be covered before the Vallée aux Clercs was reached, their commander was obliged to halt his men no less than 3 times. Meanwhile, the English, now drawn up in position, looked on in grim and confident silence. Everything was ready. Nothing had been overlooked, and although at extreme range the archers could reach the bottom of the valley with their shafts, orders were, it seems, issued that their fire was to be withheld till the Genoese were within decisive range. The Genoese slowly crossed the valley and started to ascend the gentle slope to the hostile position. As they advanced, occasional shafts were discharged, as was the custom with these crossbowmen, but they all fell short. Not till they were within 150 yards of the motionless line in front of them did their enemy respond.
It was mid-afternoon when the first ranks of Genoese archers came into view. Behind them, in a long disorderly mass, came the army of France, about 30,000 men, roughly 3 times the size of the English force, with more following yet to arrive. The English ranks were ordered to their feet. The archers restrung their bows, and they waited. The Genoese advanced and shouted insultingly at the English. Local people had lined the road all the way to the battlefield and chanting "Kill, kill, kill" as the French army passed. Now the time to kill had come. Line after line advanced, shouting abuse, their bolts primed for the first volley. They yelled for a 3rd time at the English, hoping to scare them, but the English did not move. Then, with the boom of the first cannon, the Genoese loosed their volley of bolts, and with dismay, they watched them die up on the air and fall short. Hurriedly, they began to reload in the open as the next line advanced, taking up the shouting. Still, there came nothing from the English but the occasional sighting shot from the cannon. Only when the bulk of the Genoese were in range and about to shoot did the English trumpets ring out for the attack to begin.
Then a sharp word of command rang out, and instantly the heavens were, as it appeared, black with the swarm of arrows discharged from the trusty English longbows. The result of this discharge, striking the closely knit lines of the Genoese, was devastating. The ranks of crossbowmen staggered and reeled, while, to add to their discomfiture, a series of thunderclaps and belches of flame, followed by the swift hurtling through the air of great balls of iron and stone, shook the men and stampeded the horses. It was Edward's secret weapon, those mysterious tubes that had for so long lain hidden on the bottom of the ammunition wagons, the first cannon to be fired in open warfare. It was too much. The Genoese broke and fled.
If Genoese pride had died in the air with the falling short of those first crossbow bolts, then English pride struck home hard and true with the first English volley. The Genoese were ripped to shreds. "These arrows pierced their arms, heads, and through their armor," said Froissart. Each archer in the English camp could fire between 6 and 10 arrows per minute. If each man fired at the slower rate to ensure accuracy, and if there were only 5,000 archers in the English army, the Genoese, who numbered no more than 6,000, were suddenly struck by 30,000 arrows per minute, each of which was potentially deadly. We do not know how long they could have kept this up, but if Edward had brought supplies on the same scale as he had ordered them in 1341, a single order of 3 million arrows for 7,000 bows, then we may reckon that this rate of fire was sustainable for at least an hour. Chroniclers describe the effects in terms of arrows falling like snow. Within a few minutes, there were very few Genoese who were not dead or dying. Those that survived the attack retreated, shouting, some throwing down their crossbows. But the appalled French commanders refused to allow them to flee. The Count of Alençon, King Philip's brother, set spurs to his horse and charged some of them down, slashing at them as an example. Philip himself gave the order to kill anyone who retreated from the battlefield as he saw the Genoese run. "Kill these scoundrels, kill them all," were his actual words, reported on good authority. But as his own men realized, killing Genoese crossbowmen would not help them against the English.
But their troubles were not over. Some of the elite of the Knights of France, under the Count d'Alençon, the king's brother, spoiling for a fight and crowding forward hard on top of the unfortunate Genoese, suspected treachery on the part of these foreign mercenaries. The hot-headed Alençon shouted orders to the men-at-arms behind him to ride down the traitors, and clapping spurs into his horse's flanks, he suited action to the word and drove his horse into their midst, fiercely reviling them the while for their treachery. Some of the Genoese, finding themselves thus between two fires, opened at close range against their new enemies, and an internecine battle began. Alençon's men-at-arms, relentlessly treading underfoot the traitorous Genoese, at length reached and engaged the Prince of Wales' division in a hand-to-hand melee. Meanwhile, the divisions in rear, brushing past the Genoese, deployed and formed line in succession on their right, wheeling to the left into line as they did so. Eventually, a continuous line was formed roughly equal and parallel to the English line. They then closed with Northampton's division in irregular and spasmodic efforts. All along the battle line, the French mounted men-at-arms, forcing their reluctant steeds up the hill in the teeth of a hail of arrows from the hearses of archers, closed with their terrible opponents. Multitudes fell by the way, but the remainder struggled on with typical French elan, and fierce hand-to-hand conflicts took place between the mounted Frenchmen and the dismounted Englishmen.
Despite this appalling start, the reputation of France as leading all Christendom in arms was much more than mere posturing. Pride ran very deep in the French psyche. Military honor was integral to the identity of the French nobility. Even as the French knights saw their mercenaries run, they rallied and readied themselves. These men knew the purpose of their privileges and recognized the time had come for them to do their utmost duty. They cannot have failed to understand at that moment that they were facing a test as severe as any previously encountered by a French army. Trumpets blared. Wave after wave of knights set their spurs to their horses and charged up the hill in a furious attempt to drive the English from their position, only to suffer humiliating and catastrophic losses on the hillside as their polished armor and surcoats were torn open by the humble arrows of the English archers. Each time they fell back. But, as befitting the flower of European chivalry, they regrouped and charged again. 15 charges were thrown against the English. At one point, they broke the line and fought through to reach the 1st Battalion of English men-at-arms. Seeing the standard of the Prince of Wales, they made a concerted effort to seize him.
The pressure on the English line increased and was especially strong on the right. Godfrey Harcourt, feeling a natural anxiety for the safety of his precious protégé, took 2 measures. He ran across to the nearest unit of Northampton's division on his left, that commanded by the Earl of Arundel, and begged him to put in a counterattack across the slight re-entrant that divided the 2 divisions and strike the prince's opponents in their flank. This Arundel agreed to do. Harcourt's second step was to send to the king for reinforcements. By the time the messenger had reached the king, in his command post high up on the windmill, Arundel's counterattack was beginning to take shape. It was not lost upon the king. This was not the moment to launch his precious reserve into the fight. "Let the boy win his spurs," he remarked briefly to the messenger. The latter returned with this ungracious message, but in the meantime the counterattack had relieved the pressure on the prince's division, and the messenger arrived to find the prince and his troops seated on the ground amid the heaps of dead Frenchmen, quietly awaiting the next attack.
The prince, although only 16, was strong and brimful of confidence, and as soon as the French knights came to him, he rushed at them, slashing at their horses, bringing down their riders, stamping on their helmets and cutting through their lances. As a result, he ran the risk of being surrounded, and briefly it seemed the French had managed to seize him. But they failed to disarm him, and he fought on, while his bodyguard ferociously fought back to save him. At one point, he was struck to his knees, and his standard-bearer, Sir Richard Fitzsimon, resorted to the desperate measure of actually laying down the prince's standard in order to draw his sword to defend his master. Another of his men rushed back to Edward to ask for help for the prince. Edward sent it, but by the time it arrived, the prince was far from needing it. With Fitzsimon's help, he had regained his feet and started fighting more furiously than ever, so that by the time the 20 knights from Edward's own bodyguard had reached him, they found him laughing and leaning on his sword beside a long pile of corpses, catching his breath before the next onslaught.
In point of fact, the king did send his son a token force of 20 knights, probably under the command of the warlike Bishop of Durham. The carnage opposite the prince's division was particularly great. According to the testimony of the king, in a small space in front of the prince's troops, there lay no less than 1,500 French knights.
With the chaos of the hand-to-hand combat and the volleys of arrows still being coordinated by the captains, the trumpets, the whinnying of horses, the cannon booming away, the arrows and the cannon bolts and cannon balls, and the yells, the shrieks and screams, the scene must have been truly terrifying. But one thing was clear to all, no matter where they stood: the English position was holding. Against all the odds, 10,000 were holding back 30. When he was told of the developments on the battlefield, the 50-year-old blind king John of Bohemia asked to be led forward. He had demanded to be given command of the French vanguard, for he too had believed they would easily pick off the English. They had even selected in advance who was to have which prisoners. Now he realized that his presumption had contributed to the rout. If he had not demanded the command of the vanguard, if the man in charge of the French advance had at least been sighted, they might have stood a chance. He asked his knights to do him one last service. Would they tie the bridle of his horse to theirs and lead him to the front line so that he might, for one last time, lift his sword and charge into battle? He was asking them to lead him to his death and for them to die with him. Solemnly, they did what he asked. When the next trumpets blared and the next great charge against the English rode at full tilt, the closest household knights of the King of Bohemia rode with them, all in one line, stretched out on either side of their king, shouting his war cry for one last time, lances couched and swords aloft. For them, there could be no retreat. It was a matter of fighting with the knights and men-at-arms of the 1st Battalion of the English until they were all dead. After the battle, their dead horses were found, all still tethered together, with their corpses scattered near the body of their king. With the last of the French charges failing on the front line, Edward gave the order for the English horses to be led forward. The pages ran to get their masters' steeds and led them out of the enclosure. When the 15th charge had fallen back into the mass of men on the slopes of the hill, the trumpets sounded the English attack, and the mounted chivalry of England poured around the limits of the front line. When the French infantry saw the standards of Northampton, Warwick, Dagworth, Burghersh and Cobham bearing down towards them, they came to a horrified halt on the slope and quickly turned and fled. King Philip, a tyrant but certainly not a coward, saw his men desert him in their thousands. And as he watched, on came the English knights. Philip's bodyguard rallied around him, so too some infantry and some of his closest friends and supporters. But the battle they now fought was not for victory, it was for their king's survival.
The sun went down and the stars came out, far over the battlefield. But the fight went on into the night under the light of a rising moon. Everywhere it was the same story. The French chivalry boldly and gaily spurred up to the motionless English lines in wave after wave, till all men lost count of the number. But nowhere could a penetration be effected. Line after line reeled back with their dead and their slain. God of battles, was ever a battle like this in the world before? It is said that there were as many as 15 separate attacks on the English position, but they were not continuous. In all battles there are pauses of varying duration. During these pauses we can picture the English archers running forward down the slope to retrieve their precious arrows from the bodies of the slain, just as they did at Poitiers 10 years later. A little before midnight the battle flame flickered and died out. Silence, except for the groans of the wounded, descended upon the battlefield.
Bitterly, they exchanged blows until evening gave way to night. His standard-bearer was killed as he stood beside him. The king's own horse was killed beneath him. An arrow flew into the fray from one of the English archers and struck Philip in the face. The English raised a great shout, and then another as the oriflamme went down. The sacred war banner of France lay in the mud of the battlefield. John of Hainault realized that nothing now could save the day, and forcing the king onto a spare horse and keeping hold of the reins, he and a few knights dragged the king from the battlefield. As Edward had previously given strict orders not to pursue the enemy into the night, Philip escaped. Of all the knights and great men who had come with him to Crecy, he had only 5 barons with him when he departed. As Philip fled in the darkness towards Amiens, the English regrouped in their positions on the hillside. There was a windmill at the top of the hill. Now Edward ordered it to be filled with brushwood and set alight to act as a beacon and a focal point for the English. Still, he kept order, wearing his full armor, not even having removed his helmet. Only when he came to the lines of the first battle which had withstood the French attacks and saw his son Prince Edward with his own eyes did he remove it. He embraced him and kissed him. "Fair son, God save you. You are my good son, and you have acquitted yourself nobly. You are worthy to keep a realm." And the prince bowed to his father, honoring him. He had picked up the crest of the fallen king of Bohemia, an ostrich feather, and repeated his motto as he knelt before his father, "Ich dien, I serve." Edward then began to speak about the battle to all those present. No one was to boast, everyone was to thank God for their good fortune, and they must be on their guard lest there be a counterattack by a relief force in the night. There was no other attack that night. The English rested safely with the burning windmill above them and the mounds of corpses and wounded in the darkness below, lying in the cold. There, the unfortunate lay in pain, expiring on the killing field, or unable to move, able only to wait for the dawn and the swift cutting of their throats as the English infantry began to pick over the battlefield looking for loot. On the day after the battle, there was another fight, between a second contingent of Frenchmen who arrived too late for the battle and who came out of the morning mist to find themselves face to face with the Earl of Northampton. Soon, they too lay dying. When on the Sunday, Edward expressed a desire to know how many had died on either side, he ordered Sir Reginald Cobham, Sir Ralph Stafford and the heralds to establish an accurate figure by collecting all the French surcoats worn by the men-at-arms. Edward ordered that his men now ransacking the battlefield could keep all they found as long as they surrendered the surcoats to him. Over the day, they covered the whole area of the battle and all the outlying fields and forest and the site of the battle between Northampton and the reinforcements who had arrived too late for the battle proper. 11 great princes lay dead, including the King of Bohemia, the Count of Flanders, the Duke of Lorraine, and Philip's brother and nephew, the Counts of Alençon and Blois. 1 archbishop and 1 bishop lay among the dead, and 8 great secular lords. 80 bannerets, principal knights, were dead, and 1,552 knights and esquires lay just in the area before the English front line where the prince had been fighting. A great number, thousands of uncounted infantrymen's bodies were scattered over the battlefield. A further 4,000 French men-at-arms and Genoese crossbowmen had been killed by the Earl of Northampton in the attack on the following day. In comparison, English losses amounted to about 300 men.
They had finished with the war. The Great Alliance had come to an end. The most powerful monarch in Western Europe, the head, only a few hours previously, of a mighty army, was abandoned. He had lost in the battle his own brother, the Count d'Alençon, his brother-in-law, John of Bohemia, and his nephew, the Count de Blois, elder brother of Charles de Blois. Moreover, there had been a clean sweep of generals. The army was leaderless, the flower of the chivalry of France, as the Grand Chronique sorrowfully relates, lay dead on the field of battle. The king was utterly dumbfounded. He dallied in Amiens for a few days, his only recorded activities being to request a 3 days' truce to bury the dead, and to execute some of the unfortunate Genoese for suspected treachery. He then set off for the chateau of Pont-Saint-Maxence, situated in a secluded spot on the edge of the great forest of Halap, 35 miles north of Paris. He arrived there on September the 8th and remained in solitary retreat till well on in October, leaving his army and his country to fend for themselves as best they could. Philip of Valois was, to use a modern term, deflated.
The importance of the Battle of Crecy cannot be exaggerated. It demands that we look beyond the limits of Edward's own life to understand his achievement in the broader terms of European history. Leaving aside the political circumstances of the 14th century, it was the first major battle between two well-resourced martial kingdoms in which victory was obtained by projectile weaponry rather than hand-to-hand fighting. In that sense, it marks the advent of modern warfare. Since his victory at Halidon Hill in 1333, Edward had pioneered the systematic deployment of archers to win a battle. In the mid-1330s, he was experimenting with mounted archers. By 1339, he had a projectile-based means of fighting which was exportable, and in 1346, he demonstrated against the best-equipped and proudest military kingdom in Europe that archery could and would defeat the greatest array of chivalry, provided the battlefield was chosen with care. From now on, groups of well-disciplined commoners with longbows could destroy much larger groups of the richest, most heavily armoured, bravest and well-trained noblemen in Christendom, even when they were backed up with crossbowmen and huge numbers of infantrymen. The banner of aristocratic military splendour which characterizes the Middle Ages had been shredded, not in a single afternoon by a few thousand archers, but by 13 years of careful experimentation and thought as to how projectile-based warfare could be perfected. The effect on the political situation was every bit as profound. Edward had not just won a victory over the French, he had turned many of society's values upside down. He had overturned the common understanding that France was the greatest military power in Christendom, and he had done it in such a way that all could see that this was not a lucky or accidental victory. It was a carefully planned and well-executed systematic destruction of an enemy which could be repeated again and again. This upset the commonly held understanding of God's natural order. The assembled fighting nobility were demonstrably weaker than the peasantry, and paved the way for that combination of political authority and large armies which would eventually see feudalism give way to absolutism. It also threatened papal influence. What help had a French pope been for the French king? If the pope's prayers on behalf of France had so little effect on divine providence, and had not even saved the sacred oriflamme from being trampled into the mud, how could a papal interdict on England be a sign of divine will? How could it be anything other than a sign of French bitterness? For Edward, Crecy was a mark of personal glory. He had done what had been prophesied at his birth. He had won a military victory on the continent and, in so doing, had done something absolutely remarkable. No English army had ever previously won a battle on this scale against the French on French soil. After the long campaigns and the heavy taxation, the news in England that Edward had triumphed was sensational, and the credit went directly to the king. Victory meant that the years of taxation, the strategy, the planning, and the very policy of taking the war to France were all seen as a complete success. The Battle of Crecy might have been won by English archers, but the archers by themselves would never have found themselves in France, still less in a position to have won the battle if it had not been for the king's inspired leadership. All Edward's positive attributes, courage, leadership, strategic thinking, tactical brilliance, discipline, innovation, and political astuteness, came together in the Crecy campaign. Together, they gave his kingship a touch of greatness.